Though it has been a request for a long time, I felt mostly ambivalent about reviewing the Buffy movie. I think a lot of contemporary critics delight in a good massacre, and some, like Red Letter Media, have raised it to an art form. But I know the Buffy movie holds a nostalgic place in people's hearts, and I don't really delight in the death of anyone's darlings. I never take as much joy in tearing a thing to pieces as I do elevating something I treasure. Well, almost never. I watched the Buffy movie for the first time 2 years ago. I'm not a fan of camp and hold no nostalgia for it. The movie is the misfire that accidentally led to one of my favorite pieces of entertainment ever. If you feel differently, close the video and come back in a couple of weeks. I'll have the guides for Something Blue and Hero up around that time. For the sake of completion and to honor the vote I put up though, I present to you my review of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie. Another issue this review poses is how to talk about the material. As someone who has watched the series many times, it's impossible for me to look at the movie on its own merits. I started with Buffy the show first, fell in deep love, and went back to watch the movie much later. I can't consider this material without pondering what it turned into. And so, that is the confusing, muddled perspective from which this review has been written. What might have been, and what was. The movie opens with a self-serious voiceover and campy intro explaining poorly that the Slayer bears the birthmark of the Coven and is the only one suited to fight vampires that walk among us. She's trained by the Watcher, and when she dies, the next is chosen. We then hard cut to modern times at Henry High School and Buffy herself. That afternoon, as Buffy and her friends debate the merits of various theaters using the clunky invented teenage vernacular that weighed down the TV pilot a bit.
And that's where her mom had to get a new job. Nag. Pause. She was starting fights.
She is given the stiff one-eye from an odd-looking man while trying to descend in an elevator. And in the theater, we're introduced to Pike and his friend Benny. Pike regales Buffy's boyfriend with a stirring bit of dialogue. And one of the basketball jocks is eaten by a vampire played by Paul Reubens. Buffy's parents are rich and aloof, and as she falls asleep that evening, she experiences the dreams of Slayer's past lives. After an inexplicable and pointless run-in with Buffy and company, Pike and Benny are out drunkenly on the town. Pike passes out and Benny gets eaten by Paul Reuben. The next day, Merrick, the creepy old man, confronts Buffy and tells her the truth.
You want me to go to the graveyard with you because I'm the chosen one and there are vampires?
Yes.
Does Elvis talk to you?
I think the most admirable thing about this movie is Christy Swanson and how hard she's actually trying. Hers is a performance from a much better movie. Merrick knows the content of Buffy's dreams because of course they're real, and Buffy agrees to train with him. At the graveyard, Buffy witnesses her first vampires rising and slays them both. Benny has gone full mushroom-eared flying vampire. That night, as Buffy prepares for bed, we get what is probably my favorite bit from this entire movie. As the camera pans around Buffy's bedroom, Lothos is revealed, already lying in Buffy's bed as she cuddles against him and he touches her face. It's chilling, successfully executed, and completely out of place in this movie. The movie struggles mightily with tone and swings wildly throughout. Is it a cheesy, campy comedy? Is it a horror movie? Is it a drama? I would classify Buffy the show as a drama that is populated by smart, witty characters. Mostly the show isn't funny because hard comedic hijinks, but because the characters' most successful defense mechanisms against the horrors around them is gallows humor. If this is your last hour on Earth, why not spend it smiling and having a laugh?
Well, not exactly the St. Crispin's Day speech, was it?
We few. We happy few.
We band of bugged.
But the core tone of the show is grounded well enough. The movie is at times stupid, sappy, funny, and in this lone scene, scary. After that, we get a training montage of Buffy getting all Slayerized, and then Buffy and Merrick bond over their mutual cycle of reincarnation.
Merrick, I'm not gonna croak that easily. I have something that the other girls didn't have.
And what might that be, pray?
My keen fashion sense.
Pike is attacked by Paul Reuben, and a chase ensues, ending with one of the visual icons I remember from the trailer. Buffy rescues him and brings him home for some reason, and their bit of sexy close talking in the kitchen reminded me of a similar bit from something else. The next day, Buffy's boyfriend's douchey friend grabs her backside and Buffy slayers him into the ground because sexism. When Buffy's beau makes an attempt to be all sheltery and protective, she pushes him away. Buffy skips Slayer practice to cheer at the basketball game that evening. In it, a vampire decides to duplicate scenes from Teen Wolf while completely ignoring the context from that movie, as well as the fact that he's acting alongside Ben Affleck. The wolf, vampire, figures out what Buffy is and takes off to tell the Master. Even though, wait, didn't Pee Wee Pyre already know that? Why is this chase a thing? Oh, who cares? Anyway, at an abandoned area for parade floats, Buffy and Pike fight some vampires and conveniently get romantic. Merrick shows up with Lothos and Lothos kills him. Sutherland phones in the death scene hard.
When the music stops, the rest is
This is such an awful death scene, and Donald Sutherland so famously pissed off Whedon during the filming of the movie for changing the lines that I wondered if this whole bit of dialogue wasn't pulled directly out of Southern's butthole. Especially given how little Christy Swanson has to do in this scene, it just seemed like terrible writing. In working on this review, I thought it would be interesting to compare both the Buffy the Vampire Slayer origin comic, which was supposedly much more faithful to the original script, as well as the various and sundry versions of the script I could find online. The movie very lightly covers the idea that Merrick and Buffy have both been reincarnated, lifetime after lifetime, but then never really does anything with the idea. In the original script, Lothos corners Merrick as Buffy is rushing to them, and Lothos recognizes Merrick as the Watcher he's seen time and time again. He indicates that he has, in previous lifetimes, turned Merrick and forced him to murder the Slayer. Rather than face the same fate and put Buffy at risk, Merrick pulls a gun and kills himself in order to save her. A far more dramatic and brave ending for the character. Instead, we get Donald Sutherland laying on his bed and hamming it up by completely misappropriating Hamlet's last line.
When the music stops, the rest is...
Ironically, the fact that Sutherland chose Hamlet, one of the most famous protagonists in history, suggests that he didn't realize he wasn't the hero of this story. Buffy grieves. The next day, the clan is preparing for the dance and sniping at her. She has a falling out with Pike that doesn't make a ton of sense. Buffy's skis of a boyfriend dumps her. Luke Perry shows up looking like liquid 90s cool. Vampires crash. Perry tosses Buffy his leather jacket, which one would think was overly cumbersome, but works as a very on-the-nose symbol for masculine power. This ham-handed image was not in the original script. Buffy kills Paul Rubin, who takes way too long to... who takes an ungodly and unfunny amount of time to die. Again, not in the script. Lothos comedically tries to seduce Buffy. It doesn't work. You know, stuff happens and Buffy rides away with Pike. On paper, the movie's profound badness makes no sense. Donald Sutherland, Hilary Swank, Ben Affleck, Christy Swanson, Paul Rubens, and Rutger Hauer.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
And that's the only level I find the film forgivable. The acting. Christy Swanson is trying her damnedest. Paul Rubens and Rutger Hauer aren't doing anything that would seem to contrast with the choices the director is making. But everything else is just pedestrian and off. The direction doesn't seem to understand the script, and rather than developing an identity of its own, borrows painfully from other better films, namely Heathers and Teen Wolf. The movie was directed by Fran Rubel-Kazooie, who today has 2 directing credits to her name, Tokyo Pop and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She's also listed as an executive producer on every single episode of Buffy and Angel, as her production company financed the film and owned partial rights to the IP. But everyone who worked on both shows said their company never had any involvement. Thankfully, the opening 60 seconds of the movie are kind of emblematic as to why the movie falls flat. Everything is played for humor or camp value. Nothing is taken seriously. Screwball might have been fine if any of the jokes were funny, but short of the occasionally well-written quip, there are no funny jokes to speak of, and the movie lacks any editing flow as well. Everything is so dissonant. The cuts feel weird and unnecessary, as though no one was sure how to move things from scene to scene. There's an early bit that begins with Buffy's parents leaving for vacation and absent-mindedly calling Buffy's boyfriend by the wrong name. She pouts and the scene dissolves out. That's it. This entire clunker serves to tell us one single thing about Buffy's home life, does little to forward the plot or develop anything about her character, and since the scene doesn't really have an ending because nothing is actually occurring in it, we just dissolve into the next one. The editing also sabotages much of the comedy as well, as in the scene when Pike and Benny meet Buffy and company face to face for the first time. Savor the uninterrupted long pauses and cutaways from things we should actually be looking at, and ask yourself, why didn't they just remove this scene?
Hey Buffy, you hungry? I got something for you. Oh man, you wasted my dog.
And then there's the problem of Donald Sutherland. I've never seen a performance phoned in quite as hard as this, and he was apparently an entitled nightmare during the shoot. In an interview with the AV Club, Joss Whedon said, "I pretty much threw up my hands because I could not be around Donald Sutherland any longer. He would rewrite all his dialogue, and the director would let him because he was Donald Sutherland." Included on the Blu-ray is a behind-the-scenes featurette in which Donald Sutherland says one thing.
I couldn't bring myself to say I was making a film called Buffy the Vampire
vampire slayer.
There is also evidence to suggest that Sutherland was supposed to be doing an English accent, but then shortly gives up the idea because he can't be bothered. We know from the show that the Watchers Council are all English, and in Sutherland's first scene where he rescues Pike, you can hear him doing a bit of it.
This is not a very safe place for you to fall asleep.
And Buffy later employs what would be an odd insult if Sutherland weren't British.
Now, it may not sound too exciting to a sconehead like you, but I think it's swell.
Such a waste. Many of the ideas for the show are here, mostly unbaked or uninteresting. I've mentioned in my guide for the TV show that within the feminist model that Buffy presents, Xander is a necessary component. He's the male who doesn't question, debate, or resent Buffy's power and leadership, but instead seeks to find his own role and identity. Luke Perry's Pike fills that role here, if blandly, lacking many of Xander's strengths that make him an interesting character, as well as the weaknesses that make part of the fandom revile him. Mercifully, a few of the movie's ideas were left behind. For instance, Buffy's vampire menstrual cramp radar. In the movie, Donald Sutherland tells Buffy that her cramps are a sign of vampires nearby.
And you're going to be able to use that to track them.
Great. My secret weapon is PMS.
Needless to say, using Buffy's uterus as a symbol in a symbol-heavy movie whose primary metaphor is accepting the responsibility of growing up and becoming an adult is a little creepy and weird. Adulthood and physical maturity are not synonymous. One is earned through responsibility and choice, and the other is a simple inevitability of time. And the inclusion of her uterine vampire radar feels like a misstep that accidentally tethers Buffy's power and identity to her ability to make babies, something Whedon has been criticized for more than once. And yes, this one is in the script. As mentioned, it is totally impossible for me to provide an unbiased critique of the movie. Throughout, I hear nothing but the missed opportunities and throwaway dialogue that turned into deep and meaningful themes on the show. While fully acknowledging that even Whedon couldn't have known the fruit these ideas would bear, as they are thoughts that grew organically from thousands of hours of work, let's look at two scenes from Buffy the show and the movie. Throughout both stories, there's a question as to what it is that makes Buffy different and more successful than previous Slayers. Why has she lasted far longer than others? In the movie, this works as sort of metaphor light.
Merrick, I'm not gonna croak that easily. I have something that the other girls didn't have.
And what might that be, pray?
My keen fashion sense.
The scene is played as a bonding moment between Buffy and Merrick, serving two purposes. First, to make Merrick's death later on a little more impactful, and second, to act as a metaphor near the end for Buffy herself.
This is your defense. Please. Your puny faith?
No. My keen fashion sense.
Buffy's keen fashion sense, part of her stock early 90s femininity, is used literally as a weapon in the form of the hairspray to destroy Merrick. But consider nearly the same idea from the show, where the answer to what ties Buffy to the world also stands as the reason for her death at the end of the season. In a scene from one of my favorite episodes, Spike, a vampire who has begun to come to grips with his crush on Buffy, is explaining how he was able to kill two Slayers previous to her.
Every Slayer has a death wish.
This is an enormously complex season, so I won't spend too much time on it, and this scene actually says far more about Spike than it does about Buffy or the Slayer power. Spike is a walking fountain of innuendo, and throughout the descriptions of the two Slayers' murders, he is heavily sexualizing the stories. The Asian Slayer's blood is an aphrodisiac for he and Drusilla, and he says he could have danced all night with the New York Slayer. There's really no way for him to know if every Slayer has a death wish because he's only met 3 of them. What these deaths are about for him are actually the little death or orgasm. Consider his selection of words when he talks about Buffy.
Sooner or later, you're gonna want it. And the second that happens, you know I'll be there. I'll slip in, have myself a real good day.
Buffy's rejection of Spike's advances also works on 2 levels, suggesting first that she'll never sleep with him, and second that Spike will never be able to kill her. But the relevant detail that Spike points out is the only thing that has allowed Buffy to last as long as she has are her ties to the world. Mother, Scooby's, Sister Dawn. In short, love. Where other Slayers were taken from all that and taught only about duty and responsibility, Buffy has lived a life in balance. Duty, responsibility, in tandem with hope and connection. And through a philosophical lens that doesn't confuse right with good. And right versus good is ultimately what the finale is all about. Buffy is faced with the choice of killing her sister Dawn and saving the world, or defending Dawn to her last breath. Good versus right. Duty versus love. In the end, when Buffy has her epiphany, the question of how she lived as long as she has and what makes her different is rendered irrelevant. The details of death are far less important than how we spend the time we have: love, duty, and sacrifice.
Excuse much, rude or anything?
Okay, so I got a little carried away there. It isn't that I expect the same degree of character development and complexity from the movie. It's that I can't turn off the part of me that has already heard all of these ideas before, but seen them done far more successfully. That, and, well, I just kind of miss talking about the show. But maybe that's as good a place as any to end with the thing I am most grateful to the movie for.